Hey everybody, we are going to start on part three, which is all about ventilation. So the very first thing I'm going to do is show you a short video clip, and we're going to talk about how we actually perform the art of ventilating and breathing. So go ahead and start with this quick little video clip.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells, into the plasma, and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
All right, so that video was just a great little introduction as to how actually restoration kind of works ultimately start to finish. And so I just thought that that would be a great way to start this discussion. So let's go ahead and continue talking about respiration. So respiratory physiology is actually really complex and it's quite a coordinated process that ultimately just helps us to maintain homeostasis. And in doing so, this really takes the combination of of ultimately about four different processes that are occurring along the way here. And so let's go ahead and let's just start with the first process that I'd like to discuss, and that's going to be pulmonary ventilation or breathing. And so when I say ventilation, really what I'm talking about is the act of both inspiration and expiration. So, of course, inspiration meaning moving air from the atmosphere into our lungs, whereas expiration is moving air from our lungs back out into the atmosphere. The second process here is once we have breathed in air, we undergo external respiration, where the air from the atmosphere that we just breathed in will actually diffuse from the lungs, from the alveoli, into the blood, into the bloodstream, where it will bind to red blood cells, while at the same time, carbon dioxide that is in the blood capillaries within the lungs is going to diffuse from the blood capillaries back into the lungs so that we can exhale it out. And this whole process is called external respiration. The third process that we need to remember and think about is the transport of those respiratory gases. So, of course, we know that our cardiovascular system is ultimately what transports those gases, and they use blood as sort of that transporting medium where oxygen is transported from the lung to the tissue cells, and then CO2 kind of in the opposite direction, of course, from the tissues, from the tissue cells themselves back actually into the right side of the heart, ultimately going to the lungs. And so that leads us to this fourth process here called internal respiration. So, internal respiration is specifically talking about the level of the cell where at this point the blood is going to drop off oxygen for the cell to use, and so, therefore, oxygen is going to diffuse from the blood to the cells within the body in different tissues, and different locations, while at the same time, carbon dioxide, again, a byproduct of metabolism here, it's going to diffuse from within our cells into the bloodstream so that it can be returned back to the heart. Right? In the process of gas exchange at the level of the cells and the tissues, that is called internal respiration. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of pulmonary ventilation. So I already mentioned that, again, inspiration occurs when we move air into our lungs, and expiration occurs when we move air out of our lungs. Now, in order to establish pulmonary ventilation, what we really actually have to do is establish two gas pressure gradients. And those two pressure gradients are one in which, like in example A over here, the pressure in the alveoli of the lungs, so pressure inside of the lungs, is actually lower than what the pressure out here in the atmosphere is. And like everything that tends to flow down passively, its concentration gradients or pressure gradients, really air is no different. So air, which is at higher pressure out here in the atmosphere, is going to flow down its pressure gradient and enter the lungs. And so that's one of the pressure gradients that we have to establish within the respiratory system. Now, at the same time, we also kind of have to establish the reverse of that situation in order to properly exhale. So we have to establish a situation, a pressure gradient, in which the pressure in the lungs becomes higher than what the pressure out here in the atmosphere is. And therefore, we can actually move the air from inside the lungs where it's at a high pressure gradient down its pressure gradient into a place where it's a lower pressure environment. Okay. So let's go ahead and continue talking about what these pressure relationships are actually within the cavities of the lungs themselves as well as in the atmosphere. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the atmosphere in general. So, atmospheric pressure is best described as the pressure that is exerted by the air that surrounds the body. And so what this means is that if I were a person standing down here at sea level, I have all of this air above me, and the weight of all of that air is pushing down on the top of my body. And so at sea level, we say that atmospheric pressure or the weight of the air particles pushing down on us is actually about 760 millimeters of mercury. And so if you kind of think about it in that aspect, then the higher up you go in altitude, that would mean that there's less air above you, therefore less air pushing down on you. Okay, because if you continue again to go up higher and higher in altitude, eventually you reach space where you know that there's no air at all. And so, when we're at peak of Mount Everest, for example, there's really few air particles above us, and therefore there's not a lot of air actually weighing down on us, pushing down on us. Therefore, we say that this is a low pressure environment, a pressure that is much lower than what it is down here at sea level. And so this is just a visual representation of what I have just been describing. Okay, that if you're a little guy down here at the bottom of the mountain, you're actually experiencing higher pressure from the atmosphere than if you were this guy up here at the top of this mountain who's really just not have a whole lot of atoms above him pushing down on him. Therefore, in a situation where he's at a lower pressure, lower atmospheric pressure. So let's talk about then some of these pressure gradients that we are absolutely going to have to establish in order to accomplish ventilation. And so one thing to understand is that respiratory pressures there always described relative to the atmospheric pressure. And so what I mean by that is that if I am describing a situation where a pressure of the lungs, I'm going to call it negative respiratory pressure. So if I say the word negative respiratory pressure, or you see a pressure that has a negative sign in front of it, really what that means is that that pressure is just lower than atmospheric pressure. And so just to kind of refresh us then, basically what we're saying is that in this situation, if our atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, and I'm describing something as having negative respiratory pressure, really what I'm saying is that the pressure is less than 750. Okay, less than 750. And now on the same side, or the flip side rather, the positive respiratory pressures that are described, basically what I'm saying is that they are higher than atmospheric pressure, or those that are greater than 760 millimeters of mercury. Zero respiratory pressure describes pressures that are equal to atmospheric pressure. Okay, those that are exactly the same as whatever atmospheric pressure you're currently at. And the reason that we describe them as being either positive or zero or negative is because, again, remember what the atmospheric pressure is depends on your elevation. Okay, and so those that live closer to sea level will be at a different atmospheric pressure than those who live like in the mountains of Colorado, for example, which again, higher altitude, meaning they are actually naturally at a lower atmospheric pressure. So this figure over here is actually just showing you some of the important pressures that are going to help regulate ventilation. And so, for example, of course, I already mentioned atmospheric pressure. We're going to call that either PATM or P sub B. All right, and that's just talking about the air pressure outside. The alveolar pressure, that's the pressure that's actually going to occur within the alveoli, inside the lungs, the pressure of air inside those little tiny sacs where gas exchange occurs. Okay, and then there's going to be one other important pressure that I'm going to mention in this PowerPoint and in this little info session is going to be this intrapleural pressure, which is just the fluid pressure of the pleural fluid that again resides between the parietal and the visceral pleura. So the visceral pleura being that actually lines the surface of the lung with that space in between that's full of serous fluid. And then finally that parietal layer of the pleura, that parietal pleura, again, the interpleural pressure is just the pressure in between those two saran wrapping layers. Okay. So as I mentioned before, the intrapulmonary pressure is going to be, again, the pressure that's actually inside of the lungs. And this pressure is actually kind of dependent on where we're at in our breathing cycle because it's going to fluctuate. Sometimes that pressure is going to be negative relative to atmospheric pressure, and other times it's going to be positive relative to atmospheric pressure. And so, therefore, we realize that eventually the pressure here is going to equilibrate with atmospheric pressure. Okay. And therefore, we say the normal value of the pressure that's actually inside of the lungs should be zero. Or, again, the other way of saying this is it should be the exact same as what the atmospheric pressure is. The next important pressure, as I already mentioned, is that interpleural pressure, the pressure within the pleural cavity. This one does fluctuate with breathing, but the good thing about this is it actually is going to create for us a negative pressure, okay? Meaning that the pressure here is -4 or 4 below what atmospheric pressure is. So if atmospheric pressure is 760, 4 below 760 is 756. Okay, so we say that our interpleural pressure is typically the normal value of it is -4. The other way of saying this, that it is typically 4 below whatever the atmospheric pressure is. And within the interpleural space, because this is a negative pressures create vacuums. All right. So if you think about your sweeper at your house, okay, the whole reason that it's able to suck up dirt is actually because what you're doing is you're creating a negative pressure, one in which will create a sucking type of flow of air. And that's really important for this interpleural space because that vacuum that is created by this negative pressure here is what actually helps to keep the lungs open in a sense and keeps them from collapsing. And so that's really, really important. One thing to note is that within this interpleural space, we actually have to keep our fluid levels at a bare minimum. And how do we do that? Well, we look to our friend the lymphatic system that's going to help to pump out that excess fluid. Now, one thing to note here is that if we're in a situation where excess fluids begins to accumulate, that actually reverses the pressure gradient that's there and it ends up making the intrapleural space a positive respiratory pressure. And if that space becomes a positive pressure, we're no longer creating a vacuum, working to keep these lungs inflated. We're kind of doing the opposite. We're sort of promoting them from staying inflated. We're sort of promoting collapse in that sense. And so it's really important that we are able to keep this fluid level in the interpleural space at a minimum and therefore help to maintain that negative pressure within that space. One last pressure to talk about is the transpulmonary pressure. And essentially, what that is the pressure across the pleura. Okay. So, what I'm talking about here is that if the pressure inside of the lungs is zero, the pressure inside of the interpleural space is -4, then what we see is that there is actually going to be a net of 4. Okay, so it's the pressure across the lung. right, between the lung and the parietal pleura. And ultimately, this is the pressure that keeps the lung spaces open. Okay, it's the difference between these two pressures that is what's drawing the lung tissue towards the parietal pleura, all right, and therefore keeping the lungs inflated. The higher the pressure is, the higher the difference across this space is, the greater the size of the lungs will actually be. And if we get a situation where the intrapleural pressure, this one here, becomes equal to the intrapulmonary pressure, say they both become 0, that's going to cause a lung collapse. If the intrapulmonary or excuse me, if the intrapleural pressure becomes the same as atmospheric pressure, say that there's been some sort of accident or injury in where there's been a puncture to the parietal pleura, that means that air from outside world is now exchanging with air in this intrapleural space. That means that whatever the pressure is outside is going to be the same as what the pressure is here, which is what the same as what the pressure is here, and therefore that's going to promote the lungs to collapse. And so the big point here is that it's very important that we maintain this negative intrapleural pressure in order to keep the lungs inflated. So that's all I have on our pressure relationships in the thoracic cavity. In my next short info session and short video clip, I'm going to talk about gas laws and how they can be used to help us understand respiration. So I'll see you guys in the next one.